Hi, it's nice to see you again. Yesterday we had our second class on getting things done in the development context and questions about management and how is it that we should think about structuring organizations, projects and things like that to actually ensure that the things that we try to do, we do. Yesterday we carried on our discussion about bureaucracy and the question of how do you think about bureaucracy, given that it's a dominant model, whether you like it or not, whether we think it's good or bad or whatever. I started off discussing a little bit of a recap from the previous class, which made the point that the people who thought about bureaucracy and developed a theory, the Weber, Fayol, these folks, and not just bureaucracy but administrative theory, were actually responding to the kinds of things we are responding to. They were looking at situations where people were managing in a very ad hoc basis or where they were managing in a very personalistic basis, meaning things went well when we had someone good at the top, but things went poorly when we didn't. And they were essentially saying, is there a way in which we can get past that? Is there any way in which we can be kind of more rational about this? Let's say maybe more scientific, more structured, so that it's not random, it's not ad hoc, it's not dependent on who's at the top. I made the point that I think is quite an important one, that sometimes people observe hierarchical states in governments and say, gee, the bureaucracy works when there's someone strong at the top. In many senses, Weber would say, well, that isn't kind of the kind of bureaucracy I was talking about. And it's an important thing to observe and to think about is, if you're completely dependent on having someone at the top, strong and impressive and dominant, is that saying that you actually lack the bureaucratic structures that people like Weber and Fayol were speaking about? Now, when we spoke about the bureaucratic structures, we obviously meant there are a lot of things we're talking about here, and you could advise a government to adopt many of these things. And in class, we're talking about a case of a country which I've called Massaria, and the students are doing a project in teams, thinking about how they would advise Massaria with a bureaucratic or a classical management theory solution for their health sector. And you could tell them to clarify their objectives, to break their objectives down into tasks, to centralize the system, to create a functional hierarchy, to build a meritocracy, to standardize, to create ways in which people think very seriously about certifying processes and certifying degrees. These are all from the toolbox of bureaucratic management and classical administrative theory, and they all make sense, and we should pay a lot of attention to them. They should be taken seriously. When you look at all of these things together, I made the point that a functional bureaucracy requires many pieces. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things that we need to put in place to make it work well. The other way to think about it is that the theory of bureaucracy gives us a big toolbox. There are a lot of things in that toolbox that we can apply. Tools around the development of specific goals, of tasks. And I'll talk about that in kind of one sense. Then tools about how we structure our organization, creating scalar lines of authority, creating reporting mechanisms that go up and creating mechanisms that go down that tell people what to do. Then there are many different mechanisms about how we organize our people, having a merit-based system, having a system whereby you have stable employment, etc., etc. Many, many different pieces. And in many cases, we observe that those pieces aren't there. And the first question when we see organizations that don't work very well is really to say, well, is it because they're lacking some part of this puzzle? Is it because they haven't completed the puzzle? And do you need to complete the whole puzzle to make a bureaucracy work? So, if you don't have a merit-based system, does that penalize you? Does that impact you? If you don't have rules that everyone could agree with, does that mean that your bureaucracy doesn't work? Maybe what are the minimum requirements to make it work? Now, I said we can get into even more detail because in all the boxes that I provide, all the pieces, there's actually more complex. One of the key things that Fayol speaks about is the idea of kind of having a managerial class sitting in the middle of an organization. And you say, well, what is a managerial class? And he said, well, these are people who do things like planning, forecasting, organizing. They enable people in the organization. Quite importantly, they sit from the middle to the top up in this pyramid. And the question is, well, if you don't have these people, if they aren't operating in a way that is rational, but that is also fair? Um, does your organization fall apart? Another question which one of my students asks is not just, well, if they aren't there, does it matter? And I think that's a key question. One of my observations is, well, if they don't occupy the right place, does it matter? So, if I all said, well, you need a lot of these people from the middle to the top of your triangle. Well, if you have a bunch of technical people at that point, and you have all your managers sitting below those people, or you don't have your managers, does it mean that you don't work very well? And it's an interesting thing to think about when you're in an organization like the World Bank, or even in a lot of planning bureaus and things like that in governments, where the people who occupy senior positions often occupy them because they're really good economists, or they're really good technical folks, and they spend their lives doing technical work. And when it comes to kind of being managers, they may not be skilled in that area. And does that mean that your bureaucracy is going to fall apart? Important questions. We then started saying, well, is this fact that oftentimes we do observe missing pieces or incomplete puzzles the reason why we see that bureaucracies often don't work? And I made the point that if you go on YouTube and typically you put the word bureaucracy in, you're not going to find you're going to find a lot of videos, for one thing. You're not going to find many videos like this that speak about bureaucracy as a potential solution to the problems of getting things done. Most of them are going to be about negative experiences people have had with the bureaucracy, and you'll see one of them in the PowerPoint slides and a couple in the syllabus. Funny stories or funny videos of skits of people struggling with the bureaucracy, and we see the bureaucracy getting in the way of people. I have a couple of videos of one is Milton Friedman basically saying, the bureaucracy it insulates itself from its customers, and we would call them maybe citizens. And it speaks about education, for instance, is they might produce something, but they don't necessarily produce what people want, and the way in which they create rules means that they don't have to listen to people. I then have a video of Newt Gingrich, which speaks about the world that works and the world that doesn't work, and we all live in both of them. And he kind of describes a private sector bureaucracy, FedEx, that works well, and then a public sector bureaucracy, the Immigration and Naturalization Services, that doesn't. In his case, well, the one works and the other doesn't. And a lot of people like to say, well, bureaucracies in the private sector may work, bureaucracies in the public sector don't. I think that we need to think about that question a little bit more seriously. But it does say that the things we should watch out for in bureaucracies, one is kind of what is it that makes them functional, and the other is, well, even if they're functional, do they get so functional that they become problematic for us? So the question of what to watch for to make sure that this is actually a solution to getting things done that you want is one that the class spent some time discussing, and they discussed it in groups, in teams, where they read 6 different articles, and they discussed what those articles said. The first thing I'd say is what a great class I have, people that read them, people engaged on them, people discussed in their class, in their groups. We didn't have a huge amount of time, and just the efficiency that they used was amazing. Bureaucratically, these guys know what they're doing, and I have to take my hat off to them. The first set of papers essentially looked at people who had examined bureaucracies across countries, and who'd made a bunch of points about the kinds of things you need to look out for. One of them said, well, when you're looking at the neutrality of civil servants, or the neutrality of administration people in the bureaucracy, and their distance from politicians, or their distance from their principles, I guess you want to say, it depends, depending on kind of how far they are away from their principles and how neutral they are, you're going to get a different type of bureaucracy. That if you want them to be completely neutral and completely separated and independent, that's kind of what Weber suggested. Well, that isn't the kind of system we saw in developmental states. In developmental states, we saw that the bureaucrats were actually deeply embedded in their society and quite connected to their politicians, but they also had autonomy from the politicians, which is quite interesting. So on the one hand, they have a low degree of separation, but a high degree of autonomy. At the same time, you could get into situations where the blend of this leads to a state that actually is maybe kleptocratic, or that dominates people based on this mix. So, different countries have different organizations have different levels of neutrality and distance, and those impact what your bureaucracy looks like, and you need to think about that. We also looked at a study across a variety of bureaucracies that said, well, what is the reputation of bureaucracy? And says, well, not very good for performance. And then it said, well, what is the structures that we see, and is there a relationship between the arrangement of structures and the performance? And the study, which I think has some methodological issues, as most management work does, basically says, look, if you want a high performing bureaucracy, then you need to get the parts that have to do with having accountability and process. You need to get those right. You maybe don't need to get the merit-based stuff right. Now, a student afterwards came and said, yes, but doesn't that create problems for, let's say, legitimacy and what people think about the organization? If you have a nepotistic administrative structure that gets stuff done, is that always a good thing? And the answer is kind of no, it can't be. Or maybe a better answer is it depends what you're trying to do. It depends what your organization is focused on. Is legitimacy and fairness more important than performance, or the other way around? Or how do you get a balance of those things? The third study looked at a similar thing and basically contrasted India and South Korea at the developmental state, and said, one of the problems you have a lot of times in bureaucracies is that actually you don't have one set of objectives and you don't have one set of authorizing mechanisms, but you have many. So how do you bring those things together? And in some cases, if you don't have strong organizations at the top to create this strong structured approach to creating a common message, then you run into problems. And they were speaking about having strong nodal agencies that essentially shape the entire bureaucracy to move in the same direction. One of the questions that students asked afterwards is similar to what I just discussed as well. What happens if they're shaping it in a way that you don't want it to go to? And could your bureaucracy become too focused on kind of one set of objectives, and it doesn't have enough discussion in the bureaucracy and doesn't become representative? And that's a really important question. So you have these strong nodal agencies. Do they push you in a way that you don't want to move? Could we look at some of the mechanisms that are used to construct these types of agencies and say that you also create too much power? Certainly this was a critique of some of the performance of South Korean agencies in the 60s and 70s, and especially when you had a bit of an overhang from this in the 80s, and people said, you achieved high performance by kind of centralizing planning, budgeting, by putting control in the hands of one entity or a couple of entities. But you did so by really having a high degree of control, and maybe by kind of missing out some other things that you should have done, and maybe a more balanced approach would have been interesting. At the same time, the country grew as one of the big growth successes, and we have to learn from that. The next three articles that they looked at were articles that kind of took maybe more of a philosophical perspective on the dangers of bureaucracy. We looked at the idea of the dark side of bureaucracy in Nigeria, and the idea that maybe your bureaucracy can become really very powerful and can distance itself from democracy within your society, and your politicians become weaker than your bureaucrats. Also, that you lack democracy, and you lack participation within your bureaucracy itself. And can that create some problems for you? Do we want a democratic bureaucracy? Which I think if you read Fayol and you read Weber, they weren't really speaking about that. They were speaking about people doing their jobs according to a model, according to an approach, a rational approach to manage. And we don't really want people kind of determining within the bureaucracy how they want to depart from this. But does that create a problem for you? We also spoke about the fact that bureaucracies in the West came from somewhere, and that they emerged from a political and an economic and a cultural progression in these countries, and that actually the progression in those sectors created the building blocks for the bureaucracies, and that when you don't have that progression but you have an imposition rather than an emergence of a bureaucracy, that this could explain why you sometimes have gaps. It could explain why you might be constantly saying that the bureaucracy in a developing country is at odds and not on the same page as as the market, and it overregulates, or it regulates the market in a way that it doesn't work very well. Or you might be saying, the values in the bureaucracy don't gel well with our culture. Or you might be seeing these kind of breaks between what the bureaucracy is trying to do and what the democratic system is trying to move towards. And the question then is, well, how do you manage those kinds of schisms that you see? Or do you kind of think, well, actually there are all these prerequisites for having a bureaucratic system as your solution to getting things done. And if you don't have those prerequisites, then you should expect problems, and you should expect incongruent behavior in your system. We also spoke a little bit about the kind of Kafkaesque, or the Kafkan critique of bureaucracy, basically, where you had Weber on one hand in Germany developing this ideal model of kind of how bureaucracy should work, and you have Kafka writing these novels about the bureaucracies that were in place, and saying, the problem is that Weber's model introduces this kind of formal idea of how bureaucracy is, but actually there's a lot of informality around. Weber's model introduces this kind of rational idea that everything can be rationalized, when actually there's a lot of chaos. Weber's model introduces this idea of a merit-based bureaucracy, when in actual fact kind of patrimonialism is part of our world, and we need to kind of recognize that it's real, that you have a lot of unwritten rules, whereas Weber spoke about formalizing the rules. And essentially, the article says, well, rule breaking and departures from bureaucratic norms and bureaucratic rules and the way in which the bureaucratic system works should be expected if you accept where Kafka was, of saying, look, the world is informal. The world is about relationships. The world is about these things. Well, it may say bureaucracy can't work then in that kind of world, or what at least do we think about it? So we then went into a conversation about, how these critiques impacted our thinking about bureaucracy, and the idea that, you have all these multiple pieces that need to come together about the specification of objectives, the way in which those objectives move through the system, the way in which people agree on their objectives, the way in which you structure your organization using formal rules to follow these objectives, the way in which you construct these kind of scalar top-down systems and gangplanks that go across. And if you don't know the terminology, read some Fayol. It would do you a world of good, great stuff. The way in which you have a merit-based system, you find the right people, etc. Well, if the critiques are correct, and the critiques say, well, you need a lot that comes before you to even put these in place, and even if you try to put these in place, they're competing systems. So I created this PowerPoint that showed a lot of the pieces in red, and I could have gotten a whole lot more, which basically says not only may they be missing, but the things that are in those blocks may be almost exactly the opposite of what Weber said. So wherever you have a formal rule, you have an informal rule that's also there, or you have a set of informal rules. Wherever you say, well, we're going to try and impose a goal, actually you always have divergent goals. Wherever you say, well, we have one line of authority, actually you always have multiple lines of authority. Wherever you say, well, we're going to have a merit-based system, well, even within merit-based systems, you get patrimonialism, you get favoritism, and you get people imposing their ideas about how the real world is. So we look at this and we say, well, is it any wonder why a lot of bureaucracies don't work? Maybe they aren't constructed in a way that Weber would have had, and so therefore if they were, they would do better. Maybe in developing countries that isn't something that's possible. Maybe the observation that these things don't work, or when they work they do things we don't want, and they kind of insulate themselves from citizens so they can lord over citizens instead of being responsive to citizens. Well, where does that put us? Well, I think it puts us in one place of saying, well, we have a toolbox of things from bureaucratic theory and from administrative theory that we should pay attention to, and we should think about all of those tools, all of the implications they have for how we could manage and the way in which we could impose ourselves and engage. But then we also need to think, well, kind of what else is there? And when we look at the development of bureaucracies, the development of public sector organizations, we see that we didn't stop at bureaucracy also, right? We kind of went into new public management, new public administration before new public management. We went into discussions of kind of public choice theory. There were a bunch of people who came out in response to the issues with bureaucracy with new ideas. On Monday, we're going to start talking about new public management as the development of a kind of a quasi field that actually, in my opinion, brings together a lot of these different strands. It isn't as specific a field as kind of classical administrative theory, but came out as a response to this. And we'll look at the tools that emerge from there and kind of what the experience there is. Is it that much better than bureaucracy? Is it worse than bureaucracy? Where does it put us? Pretty much 20, 25 years, maybe even longer after it emerged. So that's kind of where we were in this class. This is a much longer video than I set out to put in place. I have a great class. I have great students. Harvard is a fantastic place. But hopefully outside of Harvard, people are also finding some of this stuff interesting and thought-provoking. We're not solving the world's problems right now. We're just trying to set out a way of thinking about this and an honest approach to kind of saying what is there that we could have in our back pocket so that we do a better job of getting things done. Thanks a lot. Have a great weekend.